Carl Gustav Jung remains one of the most intriguing figures in the entire history of psychology, and perhaps one of the most misunderstood. When people hear the name Jung today, many think of mysticism, symbolism, mythology, or dreams. Yet beneath all of that imagery, there is a deeply psychological, almost proto-neuroscientific mind at work. Jung approached the human psyche as a complex, dynamic system, one that cannot be reduced to surface behaviors or rational explanations. He believed that the mind is not a single, unified entity, but a multi-layered organism in constant dialogue with itself. In this episode, I want to guide you through Jung's scientific psychology in a way that flows like a narrative rather than a lecture, something you can simply listen to, absorb, and reflect on. Let's begin with Jung's starting point, the ego. In everyday speech, the ego is often described as pride or arrogance, but for Jung the ego is simply the center of consciousness, the I you experience when you say your own name. It is your sense of identity, your continuity, your awareness. But Jung argued that the ego is much smaller and more fragile than we assume. It's like a tiny island floating on a vast ocean of psychic material. Beneath the surface lie memories, emotions, forgotten experiences, and unresolved conflicts. This deeper layer is what Jung called the personal unconscious. You don't think about it every day, but it lives inside you, shaping your reactions in ways you might not notice. When someone touches a sensitive topic and you suddenly feel defensive, ashamed, or unexpectedly angry, this is often the personal unconscious speaking. But when Jung started analyzing patients in Zurich, something strange emerged. The symbolic material in dreams and fantasies didn't always relate to personal life stories. People dreamt in patterns, symbols of death and rebirth, figures of wise old men, mysterious children, dangerous animals, or guiding spirits, even when these motifs had no logical connection to their biography. This puzzled Jung because the patterns seemed universal, appearing across cultures and continents. It was here that he proposed his most controversial idea, the collective unconscious, not a mystical space, not a cosmic cloud of thoughts, but an inherited structure of the human mind, shaped by evolution and shared by all people. To make this clearer, Jung used the analogy of the human body. Just as all humans share a similar skeletal structure, we may also share a similar psychological structure. The collective unconscious is the psychological skeleton, a set of predispositions and patterns that guide how we perceive the world. Jung called these patterns archetypes. An archetype is not an image, but a tendency to produce certain images, stories, and emotional reactions. One culture might speak of heroes as warriors, another as explorers, another as healers. But the underlying structure, the heroic pattern, remains the same. It is a response to the universal experience of challenge, danger, and transformation. One of the most important archetypes is the shadow. The shadow represents everything in ourselves that we cannot or do not want to see. When a person insists they are only kind, calm, and forgiving, their shadow usually contains anger, envy, and selfishness. But the shadow can also contain positive qualities we have repressed: assertiveness, courage, creativity, or sexuality. The crucial point is that the shadow does not disappear simply because you ignore it. It returns in disguised forms, through projection, when you attribute your own unwanted qualities to others, through compulsive behavior, through sudden bursts of emotion, or through the irrational dislike of people who mirror something in you that you don't want to acknowledge. For Jung, confronting the shadow is the first true step towards psychological maturity. Another key element in Jung's model is the persona, the social mask we wear to function in society. You have different personae for different situations, one for work, another for family, another for friends. The persona is necessary, but if you confuse the mask with your true self, you become psychologically rigid. Jung saw this often, people so absorbed in their professional role or social status that they lose contact with their inner life. When the persona becomes too strong, the rest of the psyche compensates, often in the form of dreams filled with raw, emotional, symbolic material. Jung believed that this compensatory function is one of the most important mechanisms in the psyche. When consciousness becomes one-sided, the unconscious steps in to restore balance. This leads us to one of Jung's deepest insights, the relationship between conflict and growth. Jung believed that the psyche is full of tensions, between consciousness and unconsciousness, between reason and emotion, between security and exploration, between the persona and the shadow. These opposites naturally clash, but instead of eliminating one side, Jung thought the key was bringing them into dialogue. When two psychological forces collide and neither is suppressed, something new emerges, what Jung called the transcendent function. It is the synthesis of opposites into a more complex and integrated perspective. In today's language, we might compare it to cognitive flexibility, emotional integration, or the formation of a coherent identity. All of this culminates in individuation, the central journey in Jung's psychology. Individuation is not self-improvement, not success, not happiness. It is the gradual integration of all psychic parts into a coherent whole. It's learning to recognize the shadow without becoming it. It's allowing emotion to coexist with reason. It's wearing the persona while knowing it's a mask. And it's forming a relationship with the deeper layers of the psyche, not through domination, but through dialogue. Jung saw individuation as a natural process, but one that requires conscious cooperation. Without it, people live fragmented lives, ruled by unconscious forces they don't understand. Dreams, of course, play a major role in this inner dialogue. Jung viewed dreams not as disguised wishes, but as spontaneous expressions of the unconscious attempting to balance the conscious attitude. If you are overly rational, your dreams become symbolic and emotional. If you are overwhelmed by emotion, dreams may introduce structure or clarity. Jung developed methods such as amplification and active imagination to work with dream imagery, treating it not as a puzzle to solve, but as a living communication. Today, modern research into dreaming, including emotional regulation, memory consolidation, and threat simulation, echoes many of Jung's early intuitions. Although Jung's ideas can sound abstract, his clinical work was anything but. At the Burgosli Clinic, he conducted reaction time experiments to identify unconscious complexes. He studied psychosis not as meaningless chaos, but as a symbolic overflow when the fragile boundary between consciousness and unconsciousness collapses. He was one of the first to propose that the mind is not a monolithic entity, but a system of semi-autonomous parts, a concept that resonates strongly with today's internal family systems and subpersonality models. Of course, Jung has been criticized. His concepts are sometimes vague, metaphorical, or difficult to test empirically, but it is important to recognize the historical context. Jung was working decades before neuroscience, decades before cognitive science, decades before we had tools to examine implicit processes or narrative identity. Many of his ideas are best seen as intuitive models, early attempts to map the complexity of the mind before the scientific instruments existed. And yet, as psychology advances, Jung's relevance doesn't disappear. It transforms. Cognitive science now recognizes implicit schemas and symbolic reasoning. Neuroscience studies the default mode network, which activates during imagination and self-reflection, states Jung explored through dreams and fantasies. Evolutionary psychology acknowledges inherited cognitive structures shaped by survival pressures, a modern echo of archetypes. Narrative psychology emphasizes the need for story and meaning, something Jung saw as fundamental to mental health. Even psychotherapies like IFS, schema therapy, contemporary psychodynamic approaches, and trauma treatment often find themselves rediscovering principles Jung described a century ago. Jung's legacy, therefore, is not a rigid system of beliefs. It is a framework for understanding the human psyche as something deep, layered, and symbolic. It is a reminder that people are not simply rational machines, but meaning-creating organisms. It is a call to recognize the parts of ourselves we would rather ignore. And it is an invitation to approach the mind not as an enemy to be controlled, but as a partner in an ongoing inner dialogue. To understand Jung is to understand that every symptom carries a message, every dream contains information, every conflict holds the seed of transformation. His psychology asks us to listen not only to the world around us, but to the world within us. And in that listening, something begins to shift. The psyche reveals itself as a dynamic, self-regulating system, full of symbol, paradox, and possibility. Jung believed that the greatest task of a human life is to engage with that system consciously, to know oneself, not in the superficial sense of preference and behavior, but in the profound sense of understanding one's inner architecture. And perhaps that is why Jung still matters, not because of mythology, not because of mysticism, but because he saw the human mind as something alive, something that speaks, responds, compensates, warns, and guides, something that is not merely constructed from the outside, but also grows from within. A living ecosystem of forces, memories, patterns, and potentials always in motion. That is the core of Jung's scientific psychology, a vision of the psyche as a dynamic totality, driven not only by survival, but by meaning, by imagery, by symbol, and by the mysterious intelligence of the unconscious. A vision that challenges us to look deeper, listen more closely, and treat our inner world with the same seriousness we give to the external one. Because somewhere between consciousness and unconsciousness, between persona and shadow, between what we know and what we fear, there lies the possibility of integration, healing, and genuine psychological wholeness.